When it comes to obsessive compulsive personality disorder, there are plenty of myths and signs to be aware of. Here to walk you through those is triple board certified forensic and neuropsychologist, Dr. Judy Ho. Dr. Judy, welcome and thanks for being here.
Hi, Kyle. Great to be here as always.
I've heard of OCD, but now could you explain OCPD?
Absolutely. Well, people with OCD or obsessive compulsive disorder, interestingly, have actually some level of insight. So they have these obsessions, sometimes they have these compulsions and behavioral rituals that go with that. But they're somewhat aware that these thoughts, these behaviors are kind of unreasonable, that maybe it's a little excessive. But people with obsessive compulsive personality disorder, which oftentimes gets confused with OCD, actually believe that their way is the right and best way. Usually they feel comfortable with their self-imposed systems or rules. And generally, people with OCPD are fixated with procedures to manage their daily life. And so it's a little bit different from OCD because OCD sometimes feels a little bit like they're doing these things that feel super excessive, completely gets in the way of them doing anything else. Whereas people with OCPD, they apply their rigid and perfectionistic and very black and white thinking to all of the things that they are doing. And so sometimes they can actually be very productive, but it makes it really hard for them to get along with other people because, again, my way or the highway. And that's very hard for relationships of all types.
What are the common symptoms of OCPD?
Well, as we talked about, personality conditions tend to be extremes of a spectrum. And so I definitely don't want people to be watching and listening to this and thinking, okay, this is me, or this is my husband or wife, or my best friend, or my sister or brother. I think a lot of people have some traits of OCPD, but as long as they're not impeding in your life, causing you distress or distress to your relationships, sometimes they can actually be very adaptive, like some of the perfectionism that can be good. Some of the rigidity. Well, in some cases, you want to be a little rigid. And I'll give you an example of people who are researchers as a living. If that's your job, you kind of do want to be extremely careful and a little rigid, especially as it involves your work. But you know that you might have a problem if you meet several of these symptoms of OCPD. Excessive fixation with things like lists, rules, and minor details. A perfectionism that actually ends up interfering with you finishing the tasks on your list. So much of a rigid following of moral and ethical codes that it makes it impossible for you to actually dialogue with other people and to actually have a social circle that you would accept. Excessive devotion to work that completely impairs your social and family activities, maybe causes arguments among your family and people who care about you. An unwillingness to assign tasks unless other people perform it exactly as you're asking. So there's just a really high level of micromanagement. And sometimes people with OCPD also have this extreme frugality without good reason, meaning like their finances would actually support them buying a couple of nice things on Amazon here and there, but they're like, no, absolutely not. And nobody in my family can get anything either. And every once in a while, people with OCPD also have some types of hoarding behaviors where they just, again, in their minds, are thinking, what if I need this later? And they don't want to throw something away, but then that can cause a lot of distress to themselves and the people that they live with.
Now, if somebody asked me to describe Dr. Judy, I might use the word perfectionist. I mean, everything you do, all the interviews we do, all the collaborations we've done, you do it as best as possible. I mean, high end as possible, but it serves you. You seem that it seems that it's not adding any negative consequences to your life. So why can you, Dr. Judy, leverage perfectionism to have a better life, and other people will lean into perfectionism and see it, and it will actually have negative impacts?
Well, thank you, first of all, Kyle, although I don't believe that I do everything perfectly. And maybe that is part of the hallmark of a perfectionistic person, is that you never actually believe what you do is good enough. But I would say that a lot of people who I really appreciate, a lot of my colleagues, we always joke that all of us have some dimension of the OCPD personality. Now, we don't have the condition, but we certainly are on that spectrum. And sometimes it's caused difficulties. Sometimes I have been so perfectionistic where I'm working on something for 5 hours and then I realize, what am I doing? I've just been focusing on the art aspect of a PowerPoint slide. And who cares? Nobody cares about this, only me, right? And so you kind of notice that those types of things can come up. Or I am somebody who is very scheduled and I get very cranky if my schedule gets affected at the last minute. Like somebody wants to change something on me last minute, all of a sudden they want to reschedule a meeting with 5 minutes to go. I will be the first to admit that I'm not very good with that. And so I think that people can find that they're on this dimension, but then even if I'm not very good with that, I might have that inner dialogue of like, this is very annoying, this is stressful, but outwardly I'll say, of course, I understand you have to reschedule. And then we just move forward versus somebody who might have bona fide OCPD and have the diagnosis, they may completely blow up at the person. They may say, well, forget it. Then from now on, we're never going to have a meeting. Like this business deal is over, right? And so you can kind of see that it could be a level of extremes. And that is one very common thing among people who have the diagnosis is that they have this overwhelming rigidity. The adherence to the rules and regulations are so rigid that they can't see the forest from the trees. And so again, you can find somebody last minute scheduling or not following through annoying, but it's quite another thing to say, well, I'll never speak to you again and you're just out of my life. And sometimes people with OCPD will do things like that when they become upset.
Yes. MedCircle has a wonderful series on this disorder, OCPD, featuring clinical psychologist Dr. Ramani. Dr. Ramani and Dr. Judy will both be in our live panel tonight. If you would like to register for that, use the links below. When we come back, we're going to talk about how these symptoms can affect relationships. But right now, here's an inside look into that series on OCPD.
For example, you might see in somebody with OCD, they might have a symmetry obsession. So if something's at all out of order, it would actually make them anxious to see that.
With OCD?
With OCD.
Okay.
Right, so something's not squared to the corner of a table or something. That would make them very anxious, so much so that they wouldn't be able to stop thinking about it. They'd actually not even be able to stay in a conversation. They'd be so focused on it. And then the obsessions would be intrusive or they'd have to engage in a compulsion as an offset. You'd never see anything like that in OCPD. Something wasn't, they would make sure everything's lined up just so, but not to an excessive amount of time. Like once it's lined up, they're good. Mm-hmm. So they don't have those sort of intrusive thoughts. They will spend a lot of time ensuring that their environment is, or money, ensuring their environment is exactly as they want it to be. But it's not in this way that it feels irrational.
You can watch that series and more at watch.medcircle.com. Dr. Judy, how can these extreme symptoms affect somebody's romantic relationship?
Well, it can affect somebody's romantic relationship because they are so rigid that they can't really partner with somebody. As we all know, all relationships, especially the intimate ones where you're with a romantic partner and sharing a life, it involves a give and take. It involves some compromising. Sometimes you're doing things that you don't love doing, but you're doing it for your partner because you know it's important to them. Well, people with OCPD will have a really hard time doing those things because if they don't see how it serves them and their rules, it will be really hard for them to say, I'll do it your way this time, just because I know that that's what you want. And
that sounds a little narcissistic to me.
Well, again, OCPD individuals do believe that their way is the best way. So even if their partner says, listen, I know that this is not your cup of tea, but just do it for me because it's important to me, or I think it's a great way to do this particular activity. Well, the person who's OCPD might actually try to get that person to see it their way. Instead of saying, I accept that, I still kind of believe that my way's better, but fine, I'll leave you alone. I'll do it your way this one time. They kind of have to have the last word. So they'll go in and they'll try to convince the person that actually they're wrong and that they're the ones who really know what's going on. You can see how that can be very demeaning in a relationship and just cause a lot of unnecessary fights, particularly as we know that with OCPD individuals, it's not about like necessarily all the big things. I mean, certainly they care about the big things of life too, but sometimes they're fighting about the smallest things that really are of no consequence, like how you line up a plate in a dishwasher, for example. And they will just have an argument about that for an hour, about what the correct way is and why are you doing this other way. And that's part of the problem, is that they, again, cannot necessarily see the holistic picture, and they get very, very focused on the details to the, to the detriment of better life, better functioning, and better relationships.
So certainly my father is not living with OCPD. However, his entire pantry is labeled with a label maker for every item. And I don't mean here's where the soup goes. I mean, here's where the chicken noodle soup goes, and here's where the tomato soup goes. That to me seems very rigid and is an attribute that I would associate with someone who's a perfectionist. I have a lot of those elements. Did I get the little bit of perfectionism and rigidity I have from my father, or was it more from the environment I was raised in?
Well, first of all, it's really funny that your father does that, because I actually do that.
Oh!
And when I got married, my husband made me take all the labels off of my pantry because he thought that was crazy.
I don't mind labeling like baking stuff, and you put all the baking over there, but you labeled like white sugar, brown sugar, like this is where it goes.
I actually put them on the outside, which I think also bothered my husband, where I would have them on the outside of the pantry. It'll be like canned goods, soups. Like, I mean, I don't know if I labeled chicken soup versus split pea, but I definitely had labeled like utensils, paper products, all of this stuff. And so anyway, he got rid of that. But actually, he's a little bit of, again, on that spectrum of perfectionism and rigidity himself. And so actually, we are very organized in our house, but he just doesn't have labels for stuff. But there have been times where I'll put something back in the pantry and he'll be like, that doesn't go there. That goes on this shelf. And he'll like go and move it. And so anyway,
well, if I had the label, I would have known where to put it. Thank you.
Exactly. That's what I've been telling him. So anyway, I think that my husband and I will be great friends with your father. But to answer your question about biology, nurture versus nature, I think it's a little bit of both. So we have found that people with OCPD-like qualities, that does run in families, but it runs in families partially because there might be sort of like a temperament predisposition where you kind of have certain personality traits that emulate somebody else in the family, but also you watch them do something and then you think that that's the way you do things. And so you learn that also just through the principles of observation and learning theory.
For those on the extreme end of perfectionism, where it really is debilitating, they may believe that it helps them live a more organized, efficient life, but in actuality, it's actually hurting their relationships and making them less productive because they're spending 5 hours on artwork instead of just, finishing the presentation. What can supporters do to help maintain a healthy relationship and help the person they love have some joy in their life?
Well, first of all, loved ones of people who have true OCPD should understand a little bit of where that person is coming from. And what I mean by that is not just doing that to be a jerk. That's not what they're doing. In fact, it's a coping strategy that they've developed to get them through life. So there's something self-soothing about that rigidity, that perfectionism, because they have that need for control and they need to feed that need for control to feel safe in their everyday life, emotionally and physically. So understand that it's coming from a place of, again, a little bit of self-protection, a little bit of self-soothing, as opposed to them just wanting to put you down or make you look bad or be a jerk to you. And then trying to appeal to their senses of self-protection, maybe in a different way. And I think it's really important to show that you're trying to partner with them and that you understand them, and then negotiate once you've had sort of that common link of, I get it, we're different people and this might make you feel good. But is there a way that we can come to the middle so that I can also feel good about this situation or what we're going to be doing this evening or how we organize this cabinet? Like, can we sort of think about a way in which we can come to a solution that both of us might feel kind of good about? And oftentimes I know that people with OCPD, they actually love a lot of people in their life, but they may not treat them that way all the time. And that has nothing to do with the fact that they don't love people. They do. And so sometimes it's even helpful as the loved one to really use that as ammunition and say, listen, when you do that, it actually hurts me. Or when you do that, it hurts my feelings. So can we find another way to say what you need to say? Sometimes it can really help just to appeal to that side of them. Because remember, people with OCPD actually have extreme rules about morality. So without being pedantic towards them, if you just appeal to their sense of actually being humanitarians, they actually really do have a strong sense of right and wrong. And that can really come through when they love somebody and the loved one is saying, what you do affects me in a negative way. It makes me feel hurt. It makes me feel sad. So can we find some way where I don't feel as bad, but you also get a little bit of what you want?
Yeah, really, really great insight and advice. Again, we have a full series on OCPD that you can watch at watch.medcircle.com. We'll see most of you tonight for the live panel. Dr. Judy, thanks for your insight today. I'm Kyle Kittleson. Remember, whatever you're going through, you got this.